The talks between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have become a real disgrace for Europe. Brussels, which is used to making loud statements about its leadership and the importance of Europe's participation in global affairs, is faced with an unpleasant reality. Nobody conducts any negotiations with the European Union. Consultations with it are not conducted. The fate of Eastern Europe is being decided in Moscow and Washington, and the EU's only role in this process is to sit in a corner and nervously comment on what is happening. All important decisions concerning Europe are made without the participation of Brussels. As the world's media analyzes the details of the phone conversation between Putin and Trump, European leaders are beginning to express their outrage one by one. Estonia's Prime Minister and current head of European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, was particularly hysterical, saying that there could be no negotiations between Russia and the United States, much less any agreement without taking into account the interests of Europe and a particular country. According to her, any agreement without the participation of Brussels would be meaningless. However, the European Union has shown in recent years that all its diplomatic initiatives, at least, did not meet expectations, and the Kremlin's response was not long in coming. Vladimir Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, said that Moscow perfectly remembers the experience of the Minsk agreements, where Europe's participation did not give the desired results, and this should be taken into account in all further steps. Translated from diplomatic to everyday language, this means that no one is going to consult with Brussels, since negotiations are conducted between those who really make decisions, and these are Moscow and Washington. Europe, in turn, can continue its theatrical game at the summits, making loud but empty statements that have neither weight nor meaning. Dmitry Peskov's statement caused a real outburst of indignation in Europe. The EU foreign ministers urgently convened a meeting, at which they issued another statement of unwavering support for the territorial integrity of a well-known country and the need for the EU to participate in any negotiations. This, of course, sounds nice, but there is one problem. No one is really going to invite Europe to the negotiating table. Amid growing desperation, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán said that Brussels was to blame for not being invited to the negotiating table. This is a consequence of the wrong EU policy towards Russia. In his opinion, his place at the negotiating table had to be earned through honest diplomacy and proper leadership. And now Brussels is sitting in a corner and watching Putin and Trump decide its fate. He is right, because the European Union itself imposed sanctions and closed the doors to Russia, while Russia was building relations with those who really rule the world. The result is logical. All key decisions are now made without the participation of Brussels, and Europe learns about the fate of Eastern Europe from newspapers. The answer to what is happening is very simple. It is the result of Europe's incompetence and political short-sightedness. By severing economic ties with Russia, imposing sanctions, and obeying any order from Washington, the EU hoped that this would ensure its place at the negotiating table. However, it has now become apparent that loyalty without influence leads nowhere. Washington sees Europe as a vassal who must follow orders without question, while Moscow does not view Brussels as a serious player. While the United States and Russia are discussing the future of the region, European leaders can only rush to their offices and issue useless statements. Germany and France, previously considered the EU's diplomatic flagships, now find themselves in the position of observers. Emmanuel Macron tried to request urgent consultations with Washington, but the White House is in no hurry to get in touch. It was a real slap in the face, one of the French diplomats commented. Olaf Scholz only repeated the familiar phrase about transatlantic unity, but hardly anyone took it seriously. In addition to the EU's diplomatic fiasco, European countries are facing the painful consequences of their sanctions against Russia, which have turned into a blow to European industry. The energy crisis is undermining the competitiveness of German enterprises, and amid negotiations between Moscow and Washington, Germany's largest companies are increasingly considering the possibility of relocating production to the United States or China, where conditions are much more favorable. According to analysts, the European gas market is already reacting nervously to possible agreements between Russia and the United States, which makes the purchase of LNG from the United States at inflated tariffs unprofitable for European countries. Production in the EU is becoming unprofitable. After all, relations between Moscow and Washington are strengthening, and the United States is getting all the benefits while Europe is left with a crisis that it provoked. The talks between Putin and Trump have definitively outlined a new world order in which Europe is no longer involved in making key decisions. Brussels can talk as much as it likes about the importance of coordination, but key issues are being resolved without its participation. As a result, the fate of Eastern Europe will be decided in Moscow and Washington, with European capitals acting as observers. This historical moment shows that the independence of the European Union is a myth, and its real role is only to carry out orders dictated by the superpowers. Brussels can shout, be indignant, and threaten new sanctions, but this will not change the main fact. It has been thrown overboard by global politics. Moscow and Washington are playing a game, and Europe is just sitting on the podium and watching. Well, that's a role too. The main thing is to clap your hands on time when the results of the negotiations are announced. Meanwhile, until recently, Western media claimed that Russia was in deep isolation, that its contacts with other countries were purely formal, and that any negotiations were possible only after fulfilling ultimatum demands. However, the reality turned out to be much more prosaic. Trump, who has never hidden his skeptical attitude towards European bureaucrats and their role in global politics, decided not to waste time coordinating positions and contacted Putin directly. Now the fate of a well-known country, as well as the entire European security, is being decided not in the corridors of the Brussels bureaucracy, not at NATO meetings, and certainly not in the offices of great European leaders, but in direct negotiations between two politicians who are accustomed to acting rather than talking slogans about democratic values. The official statements of the parties remain restrained, but it is already known that not only the situation in a well-known country, but also more global issues, arms control, energy security, international trade, the prospect of reducing global tensions, and even the development of artificial intelligence. The list of topics is impressive, but much more surprising is the fact that Europe is completely absent from this list. She was simply ignored as an insignificant player. Not a single word about the EU's role, not the slightest hint of its involvement in this process. The Western media and major European leaders have already begun to get angry. Trump's words were especially painful when he said that during the Second World War, both countries, Russia and the United States, fought on the same side. Suddenly, Washington and Brussels remembered that Russia is not just an outcast and a threat to democracy, but a state without which it is impossible to solve global issues. But the most shocking moment was Trump's statement about the futility of further financing the conflict. He made it clear that the idea of defeating Russia is just a fantasy of biased politicians and that the time has come for real negotiations. These words caused a panic attack among American Democrats and a real panic in Europe. Brussels, which for 2 years in a row stubbornly insisted on the inadmissibility of compromises, suddenly realized that it could simply be pushed aside. Financial reality also dictates its own terms. The United States has already invested more than $300 billion in the conflict, but with no apparent success. Europe, in turn, spends huge amounts of money to support a well-known country, despite the economic crisis, rising energy prices, and widespread discontent among the population. While EU officials continue to talk about the importance of fighting for values, European businesses are closing down, and ordinary citizens are increasingly taking to the streets to protest. Obviously, the European Union is the loser in this situation. For a long time, he was taught that he was the central figure in world politics, that without his participation it was impossible to make any important decisions. However, now reality has shown that he is just an extra who is not even being told what is going on. Macron, who dreamed of being the chief negotiator, turned out to be unnecessary. Scholz, who brought the German economy to crisis in order to fight for democracy, is now watching his partners rely on real diplomacy. Ursula von der Leyen, who had previously promised that sanctions would bring Russia to its knees, is now forced to admit that they have brought Europe to its knees rather. But the real sensation may be the possibility of a personal meeting of the leaders. The possibility of Trump's arrival in Moscow on May 9, 2025 is being discussed. Such a visit will become a symbol of a new era, the American-Chinese one. Trump has secured the status of a man capable of going beyond traditional geopolitics and building a dialogue even where it was considered impossible. Vladimir Putin's possible visit to Washington is no less important. This scenario still seems fantastic, but under Trump it is quite realistic. If this happens, it will be possible to say that the era of total confrontation is officially over. This will be the end of the anti-Russian policy imposed on Europe and the world by the US Democrats. The phone conversation between Trump and Putin marked the beginning of a new era. The Western world can no longer ignore Russia, and Europe is losing its position even in those issues where it recently seemed to be the leading force. New negotiations, new solutions, and, probably, a new global architecture are ahead, where the European Union will no longer have the same influence. One of the main questions now is how Europe will respond to these changes. Will its leaders continue to cling to the illusion of their own power, or will they finally realize that they have been used in someone else's game? So far, the answer to this question remains open. Meanwhile, if the consumption of sedatives in Brussels increases dramatically in the coming months, then do not be surprised. The political elite of the European Union realizes that their era is coming to an end. Ursula von der Leyen, the chief architect of the European bureaucracy in recent years, has found herself at the epicenter of a high-profile scandal. It would seem that she had everything under control. European countries followed the prescribed course, the media sang laudatory odes, and the political opposition remained in a marginal position. However, everything changed after Viktor Orbán made loud statements questioning the very foundation of the current EU system. Why is Brussels in a panic? The Hungarian Prime Minister said that the European Union is in a deep crisis, and Europe will face a wave of upheaval if it does not urgently implement radical reforms. He did not limit himself to general phrases, directly pointing out that the current EU leadership has led the continent to a record drop in living standards, economic stagnation, and energy chaos. Since 2022, Europe has consistently rejected Russian energy sources, hoping to replace them with American LNG and alternative energy sources. However, the plans of the Brussels strategists faced a harsh reality. American gas turned out to be many times more expensive, and green energy is not sufficiently developed to cover the needs of industry. As a result, electricity prices in Germany have increased several times, and large corporations such as BASF and Volkswagen have begun to move production to China and the United States. Orbán stressed that the European Union needs a reboot, and the key problem is the ruling bureaucratic apparatus in Brussels, which makes crucial decisions without a mandate from citizens. This statement was especially painful for the European commissioners, because it called into question the very principle of the functioning of the EU. Alice Weidel, the leader of Alternative for Germany, sided with Orbán. Her words sounded like a thunderclap to the Brussels elite. We want a strong Europe, but not under the rule of officials whom no one elected. Von der Leyen does not have a mandate from citizens, and decisions must be made by national parliaments. Her speech caused a real storm in the German and European media, and liberal observers were quick to accuse Weidel and Orbán of wanting to destroy the European Union. However, the very fact that for the first time in a long time a German politician has declared the need for radical EU reform speaks volumes. Germany is the main economic engine of the European Union, and if Berlin changes its policy, it will inevitably lead to tectonic shifts throughout Europe. The revelations from the United States have added to the tension. Donald Trump, who is seeking to return to the White House, has released documents proving that the media, including political media, has been funded by Washington for years. The funding came through programs from the State Department and NGOs loyal to the US Democratic Party. This fact calls into question the independence of the European information space. If the largest political publication in the EU received money from American structures, can it be considered objective? How should we treat the materials in which the policy consistently supported the course of Brussels, justifying propaganda and rejection of Russian gas? Discontent is brewing within the European Union. France, Italy, the Netherlands, and even Germany are increasingly saying that the current EU model no longer meets the realities of the times. For the first time in a long time, a serious demand for reform has appeared in European politics. Orbán made it clear that he would not be able to change the European Union alone. But if Germany joins his initiative, then Brussels will no longer be able to ignore this signal. The only question is whether it will be possible to carry out reforms peacefully or whether Europe is facing a period of turbulence. Friends, thank you for watching this video. Be sure to write your opinion in the comments. This is very important to me. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on events that are happening in the world. See you later.